Okay, friends, so welcome to this segment, and we're not going to sing or dance, or at least I'm not going to sing and dance. I can't promise that others won't. This is a chance for us to unpack some of the questions. We're probably not going to give you the answers, but we might sharpen the questions, and then you can take them tomorrow and the next day into the workshop sessions and really use them to good effect, hopefully. That just seems a little bit loud at the moment as well. Well, I can't do anything with it. Oh, you mean just, no, well, I won't touch it. I think we'll let that for them. Okay, so I'm going to sit down so I'm not looming over the congregation, over the audience, as it were. What we're going to do here is work our way through what we have identified as perhaps some of the major clusters of ideas. I do have a little wad of questions. Most of them came without names, so what we've done is to try to identify, as I said, 3 or 4 clusters of major topics. We'll aim to allow about 15 minutes for each of those clusters. I'll just remind you again, I think we know who everybody is, but I will just remind you who the panellists are in a moment as well. And as we go into each cluster, I will ask 1 or sometimes 2 of the panellists to perhaps kick off the discussion. There's at least a couple of times when we have questions that are directly relevant to that cluster and might be a good way to start it. And we're also open to questions that are going to emerge from the floor as we go. And there is at least 1, maybe 2 handheld mics that are going to be floating around. Okay. So 1 over here and 1 down the back at the moment. So just to remind you, my name is Jenks. Been involved with Common Dreams since the beginning. I'm currently the Dean at Grafton Anglican Cathedral. Val Webb, well-known troublemaker and theological thinker, prompting us to embrace our doubts and engage with eyes wide open with what our tradition means to us. And Val has, again, been a speaker, a panellist, and involved in, I think, all of the Common Dream sessions today. When Rod is not inspiring emerging songwriters to finish that song, the Jesus song, which has been not quite coming together, and he's not putting plastic letters on a sign, he's, of course, also the parish priest at Gosford, and well known to us from a number of media appearances and his online presence as well. Jonathan comes to us from Melbourne. As we know, we heard him just a very short time ago speaking out of the Jewish tradition, a consciously progressive tradition and expression of Judaism and indeed of faith in today's world. And clearly, as we saw and heard, someone with a passion for practical steps to address the environment and the world in which we live. And Anne Pattel-Gray, who again, I think I first met Anne at Bondi at a program we were running there with John Corripadel some years ago. And we've already heard something from today. We'll hear more from her tomorrow, and will speak to us particularly out of her lived experience in this ancient land, which we now share with her and all her people. So we'll have a range of perspectives, and my job is just to keep the conversation moving and not to get in the road. So the first cluster that we want to sort of focus your conversation around is to intentionally but respectfully misuse Marcus Borg, which makes a change from misusing Jesus, which I do a fair bit. Marcus, of course, was famous. I don't know that he coined the phrase, but he certainly made the phrase his own, about taking the Bible seriously, but not literally. And we've heard a lot already, even last night from Matthew. We heard quite a bit about the need to take the world seriously, take creation, take the cosmos seriously, but poetically, with a sense of wonder, and not to be so literal in our engagement with reality that perhaps we miss the point. So I'm going to invite Anne to kick off our discussion on this particular cluster by talking a little bit about the the wisdom of the Indigenous communities in terms of engaging creatively and poetically with the world, with the cosmos.
Thank you, Greg. For Aboriginal people, land is more than just, as I said earlier, a commodity, something that is to be bought and sold, something that each couple may buy to pass on, to grow their family up on, little parcels of land. For my people, land is my life force. It is where I come from. It's the land I'm born from, and it's the land I'll return to when I die. It is the Mother Earth that gives me all my life essence, not just spiritually, but also food, medicine, nurture, connection. It is everything to us. To understand that connection, you have to love it as much as we do. And I don't know how many people in this room could begin to understand what that spiritual connection is and what it feels like when that's torn away from you, taken forcibly, where you can't go and sing your songs, where you can't go and do your ceremonies, because they are critical to the life force. My totem is in you, and it is a part of my obligation that is given to me by the Creator, is to care for that in you, to make sure that they continue within my country. And it's quite interesting that when I come home to my country, the emus come from everywhere, out along the highway as I'm coming in. And my foster daughter, who was with me for the first time when that happened, she was like, "Oh, Mum, look at the emus, they're coming from me. Oh, Mum, why are they coming?" And I said, "They're my totem, they're my ancestors, they're greeting me. They're bringing us home, child." So I pulled the car up on the side of the highway. I said, "Don't be scared, come." And I got out and of course we put underneath their armpits and then we cover the child or someone that doesn't come from that country with my scent. And I said, "You're protected now. They know, they'll smell you." The emus came and they brought their babies. And I said, "Don't touch them, just look at them." I said, "Allow them to come to you." So when the emus came and stood, and the old male come and he's looking at me like this, up and down and everything. And I just spoke to him in my language and let him know, "Yeah, I know my ancestors. I'm coming home. It's been a long time. And I'm so glad you come to greet us." And I said, "This is my daughter." And I said, and they looked over at Shakira and looked her up and down. And then it was funny because they then allowed the babies to come in. The male wouldn't allow the babies near us until that confirmation was done. Then they brought the babies in. And the babies were jumping on our legs and our feet. And I said, "Now you can go down because now they've given us permission. Now you can lean down." And she petted the emus and everything else. But that's the connection. That's our ancestors. When we look at the trees and creation and we look at the cosmos, it's more than just beauty. It is connection for us. It is the life force that gives us life, that sustains us. It is the spiritual connection that we have. So when the earth is suffering, the First Nations suffer with it. Because that's what you need to understand, the connection between the environment and the First Nations. Because as the environment gets destroyed, so are we. So you're losing and you're having a negative impact upon First Nations connection to country. So it's something that I think it'd be great to share. And it's something you need to experience to fully understand. Some of you may have had that privilege and therefore would know what I'm talking about. And I hope that that opportunity still comes in the future for you to be able to experience that fully.
Thank you, Anne. I want to take the mic across to Richard Smith if I can. I can't do this with everyone who's asked the question because I don't know names and faces and where they're sitting. Richard's right over on the far side. Richard, I think of your second question about practical. I can read it out to you if you like, but do you remember your second question about planting trees?
Well, I have another question. I would like to phrase it in another way. Rob Barr, he listed the domination system, but the one thing he didn't mention was wealth. And I ask this within the context of Aboriginal people. Those who choose to live in remote communities, 3,000 kilometres north, are being forced to live in dire poverty. If I'm on welfare, I get paid exactly the same here as if I go north to live in a remote community close to my country. It costs twice as much to live up there than it does here for the same amount of money. And the impacts are just incredible, I've discovered. And many cannot afford to run their air conditioners in 45-degree heat. And what you do when you look at crime rate statistics, you find the crime rate is increasing 8% a year, population 2%, this is the Kimberley, and is dominated by family violence and drugs. It's highly seasonal, it peaks in summer, diminishes in winter. You find no suicides in June and July. Now, we theorize all this theology, but we do not talk about the economic system, which is the human-created system in which we choose to live. And Aboriginal people are the ones who are suffering in that system. And we don't talk about it. Why not?
Okay, thanks, Richard. Changed the question, but that's okay. It's a very good question. Who would like to respond first to Richard's question?
The reason we live in these remote communities is because it's the community that was bestowed to us. The Creator gave us those lands. And so our connection, as I said, is not a monetary one. Although we live in poverty, it's the spiritual connection that is critical to our life force. To move us is to kill us. So that's why they live in poverty. That's why they stay where they are, is because of that spiritual connection. Part of also what's happened within the Northern Territory and other parts is the influence of church, governments. That has also impacted upon our connection to country and our ability to have economic wealth or development, if you want to put it that way. We've got mines, we've got everybody coming in and taking from the earth. Under government legislation, we're squatters on our own land because we don't even own what's under the earth. So what else can we do but be in poverty because the government's put us in poverty? If the land is ours, let us develop it the way we need to be able to develop a sustainable economic future for our people. But as the legislation currently exists, we've got no hope except to live in poverty because that's what legislation gives to us, nothing else.
I think Jonathan is shaping up for a contribution this one. I can see your pen working there.
This is a fairly short question, a longer answer, although it was quite a long question as well. First of all, I absolutely agree with the right for people to live where they have the bond to the country, to the land. And I want to give an example which is resonance for me. Every time I visited Israel, when I flew out of Israel, and you might know that you have to fly out across the coast because it's not safe to fly out any other direction. And you see the Tel Aviv coastline disappearing on the left and the Jaffa on the right, or whatever, Haifa on the right, and I used to cry. And when I first took my fiancée, she didn't understand. She said, "What are you crying for?" I said, "I feel like I'm leaving my home." She said, "Don't be silly. You've lived in Britain for 5 generations, you and your family." And over time, over visits, she began to understand. And, I couldn't stop the crying. And she began to recognize, and we came to a conclusion over much discussion, that this was the home of our soul. And of course it wasn't our physical home. Now I live in Australia and I'm delighted to be here, but there's still a soul connection to a particular place, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And you break that at your peril. But at the same time, you don't have to live there permanently. And I hear many Indigenous people who say they go back once a year. I just heard yesterday, and to have that, maintain that connection. And in a sense, many Jews try and go regularly to keep that connection with Israel. So to that extent, there's the home of the soul sort of concept, and I think everybody's entitled to have that, and we need to respect and recognize it. And if we don't have it and don't understand it, then we're the losers for that. There's a special connection. Then there's the question of who pays for it. If people choose to live permanently so far away that it's very difficult to get doctors and healthcare and all of the support that's required for us to have people living out of poverty. No, what? Okay, hang on.
If you're white, we bring in the flying doctors. Okay, so totally different.
But what? There are costs involved, and then there's a question of who's going to pay for it. And it may, I believe you, I'm sure it's different if you're white, and we say that, I see the same in other places. But what I'm saying is, I think we have a fundamental problem with democracy, which is why this is a longer answer. Now, the problem is that at the moment, the way we've got it set up is people decide and vote based on how much it's costing them, how much tax they're paying. And we need to do a big education job in terms of paying for damage to the environment, in terms of supporting people wherever they want to live in the country, in terms of making sure that everybody has access to education and health and all of the things that we would expect. And we're talking earlier about free choice and about human rights. But they cost money. So we need to educate people. Otherwise, in our system as it is at the moment, the government who proposes these things, and we've just seen it recently, will not get elected, or just seen the Labour Party not get elected, because people are too selfish when it comes to it. And I'm afraid that what I think we just saw in the last election, when the result was not the same as the polls, is that when it comes to it, when they talked to the polls, people were saying what they felt they should do. When it came to putting their tick in the boxes, they voted still for their pocket. So the only way to address that is with a huge education campaign and changing people's expectations.
Okay, thank you. Going to come across to Val momentarily, and then we'll see you.
I've really enjoyed listening to Anne talk about her feelings towards country and home. Makes me feel in many ways that I don't have a home. We all tend to, we've moved around a lot, and also I sort of think back on our story. And our story is the inherited Jewish story. Then it is the Christian story that we've created. And sometimes I wonder, what is my story of home? So I'm envious, Anne, when you have that story of what you see as your home, your country. But I'm getting extremely excited when I listen to the sorts of things we've talked about this weekend. And because suddenly, instead of God being in the Christian box that we've created over the centuries, suddenly this universe is catching up with us. We can't have that box anymore. When you start talking about trillions and trillions of galaxies, I don't know about you, but it just throws my mind for a loop. I can't manage that. But you know what's wonderful? It tells me about mystery. It puts me into mystery. And suddenly I feel I have a home. I have a home in the universe. For a little bit, I'm feeling anchored.
Okay, I've got my own mic. I'll just comment briefly. It occurred to me as I was listening particularly to Anne and Jonathan that for a colonial settler kind of society, as we are, most of us have come from somewhere else, but those stories are either forgotten or broken. And my own personal experience is that I feel strangely at home when I'm in Israel and Palestine, because I recognise the junctions have biblical names and I know the landscape in my soul. but I'm more at home when I'm on the northern rivers of New South Wales, because that's where I was born and raised. So there is a residual sense of country, but there's this other country, both English and biblical, that my soul is kind of attuned to some degree. But as Australians, perhaps we haven't, and perhaps we won't find our place here until we genuinely have made our peace with the Indigenous custodians and people of this land. So let's pray that will happen. We might need to move on, which that's kind of 20 minutes already, folks. So that's longer than a Sunday sermon. We haven't got started. The next kind of general cluster that I'm going to open up, and then I'm going to ask James, would he give his question? So if a mic could come down to the fourth or fifth row over here, so James is ready. The kind of question, or the way I want to open this area up, is to do with the ecological crisis, the ecological apocalypse, perhaps, and it's the question of how do we still do God talk and faith talk in the teeth of this looming catastrophe, whether we brought it on ourselves or not. It's partly, and Jonathan has already rebuked me privately and gently for some of this, it's partly the post-Holocaust sentiment amongst some Jewish and Christian theologians. How do we do theology on this side of Auschwitz? Okay, and I'm sure Jonathan will respond to that in a second. But it's also, I've also heard Islander folk from the Pacific say, this won't happen because God will protect us. Well, no, she won't. And then what happens? What happens to our capacity to speak faithfully and meaningfully? So I want to open up that kind of question, not so much the nuts and bolts of the ecological crisis, but how do we speak of God? So I'm going to ask James, because he gave me a question which is bang on that, and then I'm going to go to Val, and then perhaps to Jonathan to kind of have an opening response, and we'll see what other questions emerge as we go along. So James, the question first.
The question is, it's very apparent that the ecological crisis is very imminent. It's a very critical stage that we're in. Can religion help? Some people are saying, well, there's a lot of people aren't involved in regular communal worship, like numbers are just dropping across the board in Western countries, are just dropping out of the congregations are getting very, very empty. Can religion help us, or do we need a new religion, or are there in the sources of faiths things that can renew us, or do we need a new religion?
Okay, so I'm going to ask Val to kick off the response to that.
Well, from a theological point of view, the question, how can we talk about God? I think, first of all, in theology, there are two things we hold together when we talk like this. We have to hold together, first of all, the story of God, which we are telling, whatever we mean by the word God, or whatever imagery we have there. But we've also got to hold together the other part, which says, does this story that we're telling about God still make sense in our context and our time? And so these questions, ecological questions, come up very strongly with that. We can't talk about God. We can't talk about whatever we're going to call God unless that makes sense with what we have today. I sort of said a bit of my answer in the last question, the idea that we have created these little boxes of how we talk about God, and this is the way it is, but suddenly those boxes are just so totally small. And certainly with the universe and the fact that we're having this crisis in our whole climate, our whole ecology, we cannot talk about God in ways that do not actually fit with that. I'm looking forward to Rex Hunt's talk tomorrow when he's going to talk about religious naturalism. The whole idea of how can we talk about God in the universe. Does the word God make sense, and in what ways? So certainly our crises are going to make a difference, and if we still keep going back and talking about God in the same little boxes from the medieval monasteries or from the 4th century, we're not going, I don't think we're going to get very far.
Jonathan, would you like to offer a perspective on this as well?
So, thank you. I don't accept that God is omnipotent. And I think that's the answer, really. Now, that might sound radical, but I think from a traditional Jewish point of view, we also don't think that. Now, they have an explanation. The problem is that if God is omnipotent, then we are powerless. And how do we have free will as human beings to do the right thing or the wrong thing? So the tradition says that God has withdrawn slightly from humanity so that we have the space to make mistakes, to make the right or the wrong choices. But whether you think God has deliberately withdrawn or whether you have a different version of God, that's not somewhere I'm going to go, except to say that, again, the word I used in my talk of Shutafut, partnership. You know, God and humans together. That's my concept, that's my understanding. And so if you don't think God is omnipotent, by the way, I think God is omniscient. I think God knows everything, whatever that means, you know. God knows what I'm going to do or think if I know. In fact, there's a wonderful film, Oh God, which I often watch with the students, with George Burns and John Denver, where John Denver says to God at one point, but you don't know? How do you not know? I thought you knew everything. And God says, sure I know everything, just as soon as it's happened. And I do think that this is the key question here. The Holocaust is not God. God did not make the Holocaust happen. It's a failure of humanity. The environmental crisis is not God causing it. It's a failure of humanity. If we don't listen to the science, we've got the abilities. If we don't listen, it's not God's fault. It's our fault. We've been charged with the responsibility of looking after God's creation, and we are failing in a dismal, dramatic way. And if we don't wake up to that, it's not God who can be blamed. It's our responsibility. And I think it's as straightforward as that, really.
Okay, thank you. Any other contributions from the panel?
Oh, just briefly, I mean, I think it shows what theism is really in that sense, that anthropomorphic theism that we've sort of been introduced to and we grow up with, and all that starts to really break down when you start to ask those questions. And thank goodness for that, because it needs to break down, because if God is, omnipotent, then you have to ascribe to God then some form of sociopathology, really, and so that just can't. It doesn't make any rational sense. So we move away from that theism to get anywhere when we start to think about that. I mean, I took a couple of months out from this job, and said, well, I wanted to talk about other things, didn't want to talk about God, and of course all that anyone wanted to talk about with me was with God. And I became really comfortable about saying, I don't know anything about God. And I'm still really comfortable with being able to say that.
Okay, thank you. Is Daryl Nelson here? Could Daryl get the mic? Your question about dualism and conversation, it might be an appropriate one to pull in at this point, Daryl. Do you need the words back, or do you remember what you sent it?
Yes, I would like the words back.
Well, you have to read it off my iPad. Sorry, came by email. I'm sure Tony Jones doesn't have this problem. Then again, he gets a table as well.
Okay. Sorry, I wrote this so long ago that it's just gone out of my mind. The question is, what is the best way in ordinary conversation to introduce people who are stuck in the old paradigm of dualism and biblical literalism to a new paradigm of creation spirituality? I guess Matthew's probably elucidated a lot of that for me and probably answered the questions that have been running around in my head, but I'd love to hear from the panel.
Okay, thanks, Harold. So John will bring the iPad back in a second, but it just shows that question of, okay, if there's a general consensus that part of the problem is the very concept of God as commonly imagined in the West, with all the dualism and the black and white universal principles that have tended to go with that, at least in the Western tradition as mortgaged to Greek thought, perhaps not the older sort of Hebrew thought processes, then in regular conversation, at a time when the churches are fraying internally as well as losing credibility externally, how do we have a cogent conversation which is going to move people on rather than entrench the culture war? Conscious we are sitting in Sydney at this very moment. Anybody like to dive into that one? What form of dualism? Well, I think the dualism was in the original question, but I think a part of the dualism, and Darryl, you might want to unpack this a bit, part of the dualism is an omnipotent God and an utterly dependent creation. Part of it is, I think, a transcendent God who is not part of creation, and creation creation spirituality. That was a Freudian slip. Creation spirituality, along with, say, process theology, is inviting us to see the way things are as part of God, and not simply that God is somewhere else. God has left the building like Elvis and left us to put the album together. But if we're going to have I'm conscious that in the northern end of New South Wales, in my country, people of a different theological persuasion describe people like me as neo-pagan. That's the internal Anglican talk about people like me, okay? I'm a neo-pagan. You probably are as well, brother, okay. All right. So again, there's a form of dualism, and it's part of this culture war, perhaps, which is going on. Anybody want to touch Darryl's question, or we just got to go, yeah, Anne, rescue us. Sure, give it a shot.
Look, from my perspective, you know, when you see the hate that's been emanated from the Christian church over the centuries, I think God left the building a long time ago, you know, and you guys have been playing a game believing that God's still here listening to you. You know, come down to the simple fact that your churches are dying because you have no relevance, you know, and that's the reality. What we've got to do is, you know, it's not that people have stopped believing in God or the Creator. They very much hold to a spiritual force. It's that they've lost their faith in religiosity in the church. And that, to me, is where the big question that we have to address. Do we continue to sustain something that is dying and going to die? Or do we take on board a new conversation around, you know, the Creator, the spiritual, and forge something new that has meaning, that has depth, that has justice, that has inclusivity, that unites us rather than divides us, you know, on the base of religion, race, sexuality, and whatever else you want to throw in there. Because the God of my people, the God of my creation, is inclusive. And to hate, as I've experienced hate, and as your people have experienced hate, is horrific. I cannot comprehend how people can hate like that. Today, I still can't understand how somebody could hate to take another person's life on a mass destruction. I can't comprehend it. So, you know, we've got to start thinking about who is this God? Who is the Creator that we look to, that we commune with. If this kind of hate can come out of Christianity, out of, nationalism, out of people's ideology that believe themselves to be superior or pure than the other, it's pretty scary.
Okay.
Well, actually, I'd just like to say, yes, Anne, I think that's the beauty of what we're trying to do here this weekend. I think that's one thing about this group that's been meeting over these years. I think we're all on a bit of an evolutionary journey. I certainly don't feel I haven't arrived. I still have all these questions, and the beauty of getting together like this is that we actually have a place to say these things. Thank you, Anne, for things that you've said. Thank you, Jonathan, for things that you've said. And I think that's just, we're on this journey, and I think we need to be really positive about being on the journey. I think the question had more to do with more traditional ideas. How do you discuss traditional ideas when we're trying to move on and be on this journey? And I just think, I guess I'm old enough to just think that it's a matter of keeping the conversation open. There are some people you can't have the conversation with. They are just so determined that they're right, and maybe we've got a bit of that determination too. But I think if we can keep that conversation open, not from the point of view of we're right, but from the point of view of we want to hear what you're thinking, and we'd like you to hear what we're thinking, and be able to talk together. The story I think about is I came out of a very conservative background growing up, and I knew I was right. But but when we got to America, we joined up with this Methodist church, and we were only going to be there 9 months at that point. So we said, oh, well, we'll just go to the church that had the best choir, which we did on the Sunday morning. It was the Methodist. We were there 9 months, and, I argued with those ministers every week because they were just wrong, and they weren't talking about prayer, and they were asking me they weren't even asking me if I was saved. And after, 9 months of this, I got to the point and I said, what's going on here? I had never been, I'll get emotional, I had never been loved so much in a church. They were the most loving people and accepting people. And I think even though the conversation went on that way, that was what made me move into a more affirming type of religious tradition. So just keep the conversation going.
And Jonathan.
I just want to pick up briefly on the fact that you talked about journey, because this relates back a little bit to the Israel Folau story. But basically, I want to be clear, and I don't think it's great that you're here and we're together, because I don't see any point in creating something new, because we've already got this wonderful tradition. We're reinvigorating, from our point of view, I would say we're rejuvenating Judaism. Rejuvenating. So what we have, the challenge is to first carry on the discussion and the stimulation and move forward, learning from each other, and secondly, to get the message out there that this is what religion truly is. But what I said about the Israel Folau thing is that religion is not in the text. Religion is not the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the Vedantas or the Quran. Religion is the journey between the text and where we are now, the dialogue with it, and where we're going into the future.
Just very, very quickly to finish that off about the dualism stuff. I think that if we go to the mystics on this one, we get some great instruction in terms of just the concept that nothing is truly separated. That God and creation, us and creation, nothing is separated. That we are all somehow connected. Thomas Berry, which was quoted last night, Matthew quoted last night, says that, I don't know whether I get the quote right, but we are not a collection of objects. We are a communion of subjects. And I think that's what the mystics tell us. And if and there is no better instructors on this kind of stuff in this place than than Indigenous people. And I think if we can listen to the mystics from this place, we'll learn that we are all one, we're all connected, we share a common humanity and a common place.
Okay, I don't have the exact words in my head, but of course in the letter of James, the most Jewish of all the bits of the New Testament, religion which is pure and undefiled in the eyes of God is to care for the widow and the orphan. And a few other bits, but I just can't remember. My Church of Christ upbringing is failing me at a critical moment. There we go. Let's move across to the third cluster, and there's actually a segue, an unplanned segue from this, and I'm going to ask Rod to be the first kind of critical responder to this question. I want to raise the question of religious freedom and freedom of religion, and indeed the Israel-Folau issues, which of course is all about football and not about anything else. But I want to frame that question by citing Micah 6, verse 8. What does the Lord require of you? He's shown you, O mortal, what he requires, that you love justice, do kindness, walk humbly with your God. So I want to pose the question as to how does that tradition, what does the Micah 6 tradition look like in a intentionally inclusive and progressive religious community, which is also functioning within a wider multicultural and secular community. And this will take us into some of the conversations which are going to be in the newspapers and on the radio and the television in the next couple of weeks. So as our resident, sometime aspiring politician, I thought Rod might be a good one to kick off the kind of conversation around the sort of Micah 6 principle in a multicultural, multi-faith, but also fearful community.
So the first part of that is what is just? What does it look like? And if we begin with that idea that we share a common humanity and a common place, then what is just is an equitable sharing and residing in that place. And that question isn't at the forefront of our consciousness. That's why we're having this debate about anti-discrimination laws and religious freedom laws. I mean, I'm afraid that this is, of course, being driven by the Australian Christian Lobby, who obviously have the ear of the Prime Minister on this one and are really pushing this quite hard prior to the Australian Law Reform Commission bringing back their findings on the Ruddock Review next April. So they're afraid that review will come back that will actually truly make things more just and more equitable. And so they want to push this legislation through, or at least part of it. There's nothing about this that's not about sacking gay teachers from Christian schools. That's what it's all about. And I'm all for religious freedom, gay. There are no Christians being persecuted in this country. We have some rising anti-Semitism. We have, no doubt, quite a bit of Islamophobia. And nobody should be barred from employment or even abused in the street because they wear a certain type of clothes. So religious freedom is really important. But anti-discrimination, the ability to discriminate under the cover of religion is a deep concern, especially when our anti-discrimination laws are all based around things over which we have no choice. Our age, our gender, our race, our disability, and sexuality. To give something over which we have a choice, equal category under law with something we don't have a choice, is a cause of great concern. And I can envisage some unforeseen consequences around that. And so I really believe we need to take a step back and ask, well, how do we accommodate competing rights in a just society. And at the end of the day, if we just simply recognise that we all share a common humanity, then it takes away that need to discriminate. I mean, I think ultimately religious freedom, a true religious freedom, is the freedom not to have to discriminate, not to feel the need to discriminate, not to have that attachment, that burden that you feel you need. Oh, that person over there is different to me. I've got to somehow or other feel more privileged than them. I don't think any of the great world faiths would lead us to that conclusion that was a good thing.
Okay. Now, I want to throw this open to the floor. We don't have any questions on this topic, but I'm got a reasonable guess that a lot of us have been thinking about issues to do with certain rugby union players. I'll go to others if I can, Richard, because we've got had a question from you already. So are there other folk who haven't had a voice yet who would like to make a contribution to this question of pluralism in Australian secular life, religious freedom, freedom of conscience and so on, freedom from persecution, freedom to persecute, freedom to discriminate? Any questions from the floor? Yep, there's one over mic down about the third, fourth row, down on this side.
I was at a community event recently where a CEO in a very large organisation actually said that he couldn't, it was not up to him to say what one of his employees, how they might behave and what they might say outside the workplace. Within the workplace, he had the capacity to actually, through policy and procedure, to actually call somebody out on what they might say, what discriminative, sexual harassment, etc. And it was interesting that it was said that there might have been a time in our history where we might have said that, yes, the secular was one thing and the religious world was another, but that it's no longer that anymore, that they're interwoven.
Hang on. I'm finding it really hard to distinguish what you're saying. Others, perhaps if the mic is not quite so close,
Okay.
and if you speak a little bit more slowly, just to let a bit of separation between the words.
Yeah. So what I was saying was that a CEO in an organisation was actually saying that he can't interfere in the personal life of an employee in terms of what they might say or what actions they might take, but in the workplace he could. So he was talking about the Folau situation where a rugby or a football thing was saying, in your private life you can't do this. So he was saying that's not possible for us to do that in the workplace. I can't go outside the parameter or the boundary of the workplace, so I can't actually say what somebody says outside the workplace is discriminating. But I think we live in a world now where those things are interwoven, so they're not separate silos. So the greater dilemma is to actually know whether you can. It's frightening, I think, sometimes for people to say what's okay in this setting and what's okay in this setting. So competing rights really struggle in that context because, law or policy in a workplace might say one thing, but law and policy in another place says another. So how do we balance those things of who makes the moral, ethical law? It's not just church business. It's not just government business.
Okay.
Can I just very quickly
Sure.
respond to that? I think people of faith need to take some responsibility in terms of where they work, at what organisations. So, for instance, I have religiously motivated thoughts about climate change and fossil fuels. I cannot expect to work for Adani. I can't expect for Adani to pay me $100,000 a year and I stand outside their office holding up a Stop Adani sign. I think Australian Rugby have a very well and clearly articulated policy about inclusion, especially on sexuality. I think if Israel Folau wants to have the integrity of his faith, and I totally support him, then he's got to have the integrity of his faith. Say, "Look, sorry guys, your values and mine don't match up. I don't want to work for you anymore." I think we need to take responsibility, you know, and so, but just very, very quickly on the other part, you try working for the public service and saying something against the government on your Facebook page. You'll lose your job because, and you know, lots of organisations have parameters of values that apply to their employees outside of work time. And so that's not an uncommon thing at all, really. Yeah.
When I look at this whole issue of freedom of religion, you know, we've had that in Australia, where, you know, hate has been spewed everywhere, where we're downing somebody. And the last thing that I want to do is for that faith to be used to hate someone else or to spew that hate onto someone else and somehow denigrate their humanity because they don't fit the image or my understanding of what I think is Christian, you know? So for Lau to do what he did, it was wrong from my perspective, and that's my view. To be able to now have a debate where people are actually paying for his legal fees around the right to have religious freedom. Well, where's the KKK? What about their religious freedom? Are we going to support them? You know what I mean? How ridiculous is this going to get? You know, if your freedom to espouse whatever ideology you want is going to impinge on someone else's humanity, then I've got a problem with it. Because that to me isn't Christianity. You know? And the first principle, where's love? Where's love? Hate the sin but love the sinner, right? What we say, isn't that what we say? Whether we understand it or not, but that's not being espoused here. So, you know, I just think it's absolutely disgusting what's going on, and I feel pretty strongly, and a lot of Aboriginal people do too. In fact, they said, you know, it's time you went home, Val. You're in our country now, and what about our religious freedom? We haven't had it. So, you know, we want it too.
I think Val might have been born here, actually, but I'm not sure. Okay. A whole lot of us would have to get back on the boat if we go that way. I just want a couple of questions. I just want to make one comment. I think part of what's going on, particularly with the conservative Christian requests for greater protections, is there's an unexamined assumption that our beliefs are true in a way that no other religious beliefs are true. That if you're a Muslim, you don't have the option of claiming privilege in various areas of personal and social life just because it's taught in the Quran. We say, sorry, time out, you're in Australia. It's a secular Western culture. We're not quite brave enough to say that to the conservative Christians yet. So that's, I think, part of what the underlying dilemma is. So over to Jonathan, and then if the mic could come down to this, oh, it's already there. So Jonathan first, and then the gentleman.
So I'd like to go back to the Micah part of the question and say the walk humbly with your God part, and draw attention to what we say that all traditions have the golden rule. I want to draw attention to something which I think is very important. There are two versions of the golden rule. There's the positive and the negative. There's one that says, do to others as you want to be done by. That means if you think that that you should be treated in a positive way, you should treat others in a positive way. But if you want to punish others, then you know if you don't agree with what somebody's doing, then you're limited by. You're telling other people that they should be like you, effectively. But Hillel's version is, do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself. You know, it seems to me that one of them is imposing views on other people. If you want to be, if you believe in the one God, then you're saying everybody else has to believe in the one God. Whereas if you are using the second version, the negative, it's prevention of harm, if you like. And I think that that's important here. So I didn't make that very clear, but I think that's very important because that's walking humbly with God. It's not to tell people what they have to believe, but to prevent telling people what they mustn't do, as long as they're not harming other people, of course.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. My name's David Fleming. I really appreciate all that's happening this few days, so thank you for everyone who's contributing. The thought that seems clear to me is that what is happening in our society now is the claiming of a victim label gives you an ACE card. And I think what has happened, like many things that have been hijacked from our faith throughout our whole journey, is that there's a hijacking of the victim card, which says I have a right but no responsibility. And I think as people of faith, we might need to talk a bit more about what our responsibilities are, not just our rights.
Sure. And way back in about 400 odd years ago with the Treaty of Westphalia, that we don't hear a lot about in Australian school life, the background there was because that the good Christians of Western Europe, the Catholics and the Protestants, had been fighting each other for 100 years. And it was a disaster. And it was bad for business as well. So eventually you get a peace treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia. And actually our secular society, which has explicit religious freedom built into it, is not a freedom, it's a freedom from religion in public life, to create a safe, secular, non-partisan, non-sectarian marketplace where Jews and Catholics and Protestants could function. So when you were the town clerk or the marriage clerk issuing marriage licenses, you did it as a Dutchman. You didn't do it as a Catholic or a Jew or a Protestant. When you went home, you prayed how you wanted to pray. You'd light your Shabbat candle, say your Hail Mary, read your Bible, whatever. When you came to work, when you went to the market, when you went to the bank, you're a Dutchman. Okay, so it's actually freedom from religion in order to create a safe, open square where we can be together. And that's, it seems to me that's particularly important in our kind of settler society, where waves of people in the last 200 years have come from other places, and we need a compact where we create a safe, common space, common ground, common dreams, and then in our own corners we can be as prejudiced or as generous as we want to be. But the responsibility is to create a safe place in the public for everybody, irrespective of their beliefs, and not to go for the victim card. Yeah. All right, we're actually about 30 seconds away from end of time. Rosalie's going to kill me if I don't let her have the last word, so...
Well, I've kept quiet all this time, Greg. I would just ask that question, the question of you, Greg, when you talk about creating a safe place. How then in our society, which is multicultural, multi-faith, but it also has a strong Christian element, for example, Christmas, Easter, etc. How then do we allow that to happen if people are going to, in the workplace, and I think particular of education, where we might celebrate Christmas? How do we allow that? It's not in any sense a secular place.
Well, I think the experience in other equally multicultural and conflicted situations, I'm thinking, for example, of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious school that operates in the YMCA building in what I call West Jerusalem. And they celebrate the Christian festivals, the Muslim festivals, the Jewish festivals, the Israeli days, the Palestinian days. The children grow up knowing and loving everybody's festival. At home they're not Buddhist, but at home they're Muslim or Jewish or Christian or whatever. But we don't have to have a religion-free public space in order for the public space to be free and inclusive. We just have to get rid of privilege and the presumption that my myths are true and his myths are not true, and that I'm privileged in a way that that person is not. So I think we don't have, and again, we don't have to play into the extremist card that, oh, so you don't want to have Easter bunny parades at Easter time. Frankly, I don't. 'cause
I
it's
don't
nothing
either,
to do with
actually.
Easter. But I mean, if that's how the childcare centre wants to celebrate Easter, well, they're not going to come to church anyway. They might as well think it's the Easter bunny's birthday. But let them celebrate, okay? And that's the Anglican school, yeah. But anyway.
And just on that whole notion of freedom, with every freedom, if I have freedom myself, I just make this as a comment, Tony, hope you'll take this as a comment. If I have freedom, then I must allow the same Kantian philosophy. I must allow the same freedom to everybody else.
Sure.
My concern about the freedom of speech is that it's freedom not of speech, but it's freedom to vent.
Sure, and social media and part of the culture war context, I think, is kind of fueling that debate, because we're not as good at being in conversation where we differ. We go into our echo chambers on Facebook or whatever. We really are out of time. Now, next week, no, there won't be a next week. So, well, hopefully there'll be a next week, but we won't be sitting here at Newington this time next week. Thank you, especially to the panellists. Thank you to everybody. And we'll see you at Pitt Street soon.